I'll defend you. The black maid who saved a mafia boss after his lawyer abandoned him in court. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. The echoes of murmurs from the audience filled the space, bouncing off the cold, sterile walls. The once confident mafia boss, Antonio Vargo, stood at the center, his fate hanging in the balance. His lawyer, a high-powered professional known for winning every case, was nowhere to be seen. Abandoned. The judge looked down from the bench, frustration painting his face. Mr. Vargo, your lawyer has failed to appear. This is unacceptable, the judge declared, his voice cutting through the growing discomfort in the room. Antonio's steely gaze never wavered, but inside, his heart raced. He was a man used to power, to controlling situations, but this was out of his hands. The opposition was relentless, and without his lawyer, Antonio had no defense. His eyes flickered to the audience, briefly meeting the eyes of his staff. They were helpless, unsure of what to do next. But in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. A soft voice from the back of the courtroom spoke up. Your Honor, I believe I can help. The room went silent. Everyone turned toward the source of the voice. It was Lila, the black maid who worked at Antonio's mansion. She stood there, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice was steady. She had no formal legal training, no experience in the courtroom, but she had observed enough over the years. She had seen the contracts, heard the arguments, and had even helped with the paperwork. She knew more than anyone realized. Antonio stared at her in disbelief. Lila, what are you doing here? He asked, his tone low but sharp. I've been following the case, sir, Lila replied, her eyes locked on the judge. I've seen the documents. I think I know what's going on here. The judge, equally surprised and curious, motioned for her to come forward. This is highly unusual, but proceed, he said, though his tone made it clear that he had no choice but to listen. Lila walked up to the bench, her shoes clicking softly against the floor. She felt the weight of the room on her, but she squared her shoulders and spoke clearly, every word deliberate. The terms in the contract your lawyer presented. There's a clause that's meant to trap you. It's designed to leave you with no way out if things go wrong. Antonio's eyes widened. He hadn't noticed. How could he have missed it? She continued, pointing to the specific section in the contract. This clause isn't just unfair, it's illegal. It leaves you vulnerable to litigation without any proper defense. If you sign this, you're agreeing to something that could destroy everything you've worked for. The room was silent again. Antonio's lawyer had been paid handsomely for this, and yet here was Lila, the woman who cleaned his mansion and served him every day, uncovering a mistake that could ruin him. The judge leaned forward, his interest piqued. Do you have more evidence to support this claim? He asked. Lila nodded, pulling out a stack of papers from the briefcase she'd brought. I do, Your Honor. I've cross-referenced the contract with previous cases. It's all here. As she handed over the papers, Antonio felt a mix of disbelief and gratitude. How could this woman, his maid, have saved him from this mess? The weight of the situation began to lift from his shoulders. He had never expected to find salvation in someone like Lila, but there she was, standing tall and confident, offering the only real defense he had. I'll defend you, Mr. Vargo, she said softly, her eyes meeting his. Antonio's heart skipped a beat. For the first time in the courtroom, he wasn't sure if he was the most powerful person in the room. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. I am glad you're still with us as we continue the story. Lila's words had just changed everything for Antonio Vargo, the notorious mafia boss, who, for the first time in a long while, found himself feeling vulnerable. Lila, the unassuming maid, had just exposed a fatal flaw in the contract, a trap laid by his enemies that could destroy him if he followed through with it. The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the rustling of papers as Lila handed over her evidence. The judge leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Antonio, still in disbelief, stared at her, trying to comprehend how this woman, his maid, had saved him from the clutches of disaster. This is unprecedented, the judge said slowly, scanning the documents. But it seems you've made your point, Miss Lila. The courtroom, once filled with whispers and tension, was now eerily quiet, as everyone processed the unexpected turn of events. Antonio's lawyer, the very man he had trusted to defend him, was nowhere to be found, leaving him with nothing but Lila's sharp intellect and courage. Antonio turned his gaze toward Lila. "I owe you everything," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of awe. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile on her face. "You don't owe me anything, sir. I just did what needed to be done." The judge, still reviewing the paperwork, paused for a moment. "Mr. Vargo, it appears that we have a few options now. We'll need to reconvene, but based on the information presented, your case is not as dire as it seemed." Antonio felt the weight of the last few days lift off his shoulders. The court's atmosphere shifted from one of impending doom to a cautious optimism. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Antonio allowed himself to breathe. But as the judge began to discuss the next steps, his mind kept returning to Lila, the maid, the woman who had saved him without hesitation, without any expectation of reward. The thought lingered, and he realized something profound. He had been living a life where power and intimidation ruled. He had never truly known what it meant to rely on someone for help, someone outside his world of criminals and sycophants. Yet here she was, a woman from an entirely different world, a world he had often looked down on. As the judge wrapped up the proceedings, Lila stood silently beside him. There was no fanfare, no applause, just a quiet acknowledgement that something extraordinary had just happened. The judge looked at Antonio one last time. "You're free to go, Mr. Vargo. I'll make sure this new information is taken into account." Antonio nodded, still processing the whirlwind of emotions. His lawyer had failed him, but Lila had not only saved his life, but also his entire empire. As he stepped out of the courtroom, Antonio felt a deep sense of gratitude, though he had no idea how to express it. Lila followed him quietly, her presence calm and steady. "You did it," he said finally, his voice full of respect. "You saved me." Lila looked up at him, her face unreadable. "I did what anyone would have done." She glanced at him briefly, but there was a quiet strength in her gaze. Antonio stopped walking and turned to face her. "No, Lila," he said, his tone softening. "What you did, it was more than just helping me. You saw something no one else saw. You're smarter than all of us." She shook her head, not allowing herself to take credit. "I just followed the facts," she replied quietly. But Antonio knew better. She had done more than just follow the facts. She had trusted her instincts, her knowledge, and her ability to see through the deception around her. As they reached the steps outside the courthouse, Antonio stopped once more, turning to face her fully. "I can't just thank you, Lila. You've done more for me than anyone in my life. If you ever need anything, anything at all, just say the word." Lila met his eyes and gave him a small nod. "I'll be fine, sir." She said the words calmly, but there was something in her voice that hinted at a deeper understanding, something beyond the surface of their relationship. For the first time, Antonio felt a sense of humility that he had never experienced before. This wasn't just about power or money. It was about trust, respect, and the realization that sometimes the most unexpected people are the ones who make the biggest difference. As they parted ways, Antonio walked away with a new sense of perspective. He had always prided himself on controlling every aspect of his life, but now he understood that true power sometimes came from letting others in, from trusting those who didn't have to be in his world to care for him. He had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in years, it felt like the path was no longer just about survival. It was about something more, something human. I hope you've been following closely as the story unfolds, because what happens next will surprise you. After Lila's quiet but powerful intervention in the courtroom, the days that followed were filled with a strange mix of gratitude and tension. Antonio Vargo, the Mafia boss who had once been untouchable, now found himself navigating uncharted waters. For the first time, he felt vulnerable, not just because of the legal battle, but because of the woman who had saved him, Lila. She had proven herself to be not only smart and capable, but someone who understood far more than the people around her realized. Antonio couldn't quite shake the thought that perhaps he had underestimated the people in his life, especially the ones who weren't in his inner circle. The world he had built, full of fear and loyalty, suddenly felt like it had a crack in it. As much as he tried to push the thought aside, he couldn't ignore the fact that Lila had stood up for him when no one else would. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, a deep, unsettling sense of respect. That night, Antonio sat alone in his study, the weight of the day's events pressing on him. His mind kept returning to Lila. He hadn't even known her for long, yet she had become the one person he could rely on in a moment of crisis. There was something about her quiet confidence that intrigued him. He had always surrounded himself with people who feared him or wanted something from him. But Lila, she didn't seem to care about his power. She just did what was right. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," Antonio called. The door opened, and there she was, Lila, standing in the doorway, her posture straight, her eyes meeting his. She was still in her maid's uniform, but there was a certain grace about her that he hadn't noticed before. "Mr. Vargo, I just wanted to thank you for your words earlier," she said, her voice steady, but there was a hint of something softer behind her words. Antonio looked at her, his usual stern expression softening just a little. "I meant what I said, Lila. You've done more for me than anyone else could have." He paused, not quite sure how to continue. "You've proven that there's more to a person than what they appear to be on the outside." Lila stood there for a moment, as if she hadn't quite expected this acknowledgement. "I just did what I thought was right," she replied quietly. Antonio could sense the humility in her voice, but also a quiet pride. She wasn't looking for recognition, but he felt compelled to give it to her. "You saved my empire today. No one else could have done what you did. I've never had anyone do something like that for me, without asking for anything in return." Lila shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "I wasn't looking for anything, Mr. Vargo. I just saw something no one else did." Her eyes were calm, but there was an intensity behind them that Antonio couldn't quite place. "You're not like the others," he said, more to himself than to her. "No, I'm not," Lila replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't care about your wealth or your power. I care about doing what's right." Antonio felt a strange surge of admiration for her. This woman, his maid, had done what no one else had dared to do. She had put everything on the line for him, not for money, not for power, but for a sense of what was just. "I want to offer you something," Antonio said, standing up from his desk. "Anything you want. If you ever need help, if you ever want to leave this job, I can arrange for you to have anything you need." Lila shook her head. "Thank you, Mr. Vargo, but I'm fine. I don't need anything." Antonio couldn't help but feel a little taken aback by her response. Most people, especially those who worked for him, would have jumped at the opportunity. But not Lila. She wasn't motivated by material wealth. And that, in itself, made her stand out in his eyes. "I see," he said slowly, walking over to his window and staring out at the city below. The lights twinkled in the distance, but it was hard to shake the feeling that his world was shifting. Maybe it had been for a while now, but he had never really noticed it. "You're different," he added quietly, almost to himself. Lila didn't respond at first. Then she stepped forward, her voice gentle. "I'm just someone who cares," she said, her gaze unwavering. Antonio turned to face her, his expression hardening again. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that you don't matter," he said, his voice low but filled with something deeper. "I've spent my life telling myself that the world is all about power and control. But you've shown me that there's more to life than that." For a moment, there was silence between them. Antonio realized something important. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, hiding from the world. But Lila, in her quiet way, had torn down those walls, one small action at a time. It was a humbling realization, one that he wasn't quite ready to confront yet. But he knew this. Things were changing, and Lila had played a part in that change. The evening grew darker, and the weight of the conversation hung in the air. Antonio had never been one for emotions or sentimentality, but for some reason, standing there with Lila, he felt as though he was on the cusp of something important, something he couldn't yet define. And as she left the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that she had just begun to change the course of his life. "I hope you're still with us, because what happens next will challenge everything Antonio thought he knew about himself." It had been a few days since the courtroom, and while the legal battle seemed to have settled, something deeper was stirring in Antonio. Lila's actions had made him rethink his whole worldview. No longer was it just about power and control. He began to realize that there was more to a person than the roles they played in his life. His mind kept going back to her, the maid who had saved him, who saw something in the situation that no one else could. That night, as he walked through the mansion's grand hallways, the usual coldness of his world seemed to weigh him down. He had built this empire with steel and fire, using fear to get what he wanted. But now, standing in the silence of his home, he was beginning to understand that perhaps fear wasn't the most effective tool. Perhaps, just maybe, respect and trust were more powerful. Antonio stopped at the door to his study and hesitated. Inside, Lila was quietly dusting the shelves, her presence a stark contrast to the world he inhabited. She looked up when he entered, but didn't say anything. She was as calm and composed as ever, as if their entire courtroom ordeal had been nothing more than a brief, passing moment. "You've been avoiding me, Mr. Vargo," Lila said softly, her eyes never leaving the task at hand. Antonio swallowed. He didn't mean to avoid her, but something about her presence unsettled him. "I haven't been avoiding you," he said, his voice betraying a hint of unease. "I've just been thinking." Lila put down the duster and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Thinking about what?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. Antonio hesitated. For a moment, he didn't know how to put his thoughts into words. How could he explain to her that everything he had built felt fragile now? How could he explain that in saving him, she had unknowingly opened a door to a world he had spent his entire life shutting out? "About everything," he said finally, his voice rough. "About how I've spent my life chasing power and control. How I've built this empire by making people fear me. And now I see that there's more to life than that." Lila didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked toward him, her movements graceful, unhurried. When she reached him, she stopped, standing a few feet away, giving him space. "What are you saying, Mr. Vargo?" she asked, her tone still calm, but with a flicker of curiosity. Antonio ran a hand through his hair. "I'm saying that I've been wrong," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've used fear to get what I wanted, but it's left me lonely. And now, after what happened in the courtroom, I see that there's more to life than power. You showed me that. You didn't act out of fear or greed. You acted because you cared about doing what was right." Lila's eyes softened slightly, but she didn't speak. She simply waited for him to continue. Antonio took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I've spent so long controlling everything around me. But you—" He paused, searching for the right words. "You made me realize that sometimes, the most important thing is trusting others. Allowing people in." Lila took a small step forward. "Trust is a difficult thing," she said quietly. "Especially for someone like you." Antonio nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had built his life on mistrust, using power to protect himself from the world. But now, as he stood before her, he realized that his fear had been his biggest prison. "I don't know if I can change overnight," he admitted. "But I want to. I want to stop relying on fear and start relying on something real." Lila looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. "It's not about changing overnight," she said. "It's about being willing to change. To admit that you don't have all the answers." Antonio felt a pang in his chest. It was the truth. He had spent so much time convincing himself that he was invincible, that he had all the answers. But now, standing in front of Lila, he felt vulnerable, exposed, and for the first time, it didn't scare him. "I don't know if I can do this alone," he said, his voice low. "But I want to try, and I want you to help me." Lila's gaze softened. "I'm here to help, Mr. Vargo, but I won't do it for you. You have to be willing to make the changes yourself." Antonio nodded slowly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to control everything. "I will," he said firmly. "I will make the changes. But I need you by my side." Lila regarded him for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Then we'll see where this path leads," she said quietly. For the first time, Antonio felt a sense of hope that he hadn't known in a long time. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about something deeper, something more human. And for the first time, he felt ready to embrace it. "I hope you're ready, because what happens next takes a sharp turn in this story." Antonio had made up his mind. He was done relying on fear and control to run his world. But breaking old habits wasn't going to be easy. Over the next few days, he found himself constantly thinking about Lila's words and the way she had opened his eyes to a different path. He had always thought that power came from being untouchable, from standing alone. But Lila had shown him that real power was found in trust, in human connection. It was a realization that both terrified and exhilarated him. One evening, after a long day of handling his usual business, Antonio sat alone in his study, staring at the darkened skyline outside his window. His phone buzzed on the desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Lila. "We need to talk," it read. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen her in a few days, and something about her message made him uneasy. He immediately replied, asking her to come to his office. It was only a short time later when Lila appeared at the door, her usual calm demeanor in place. But there was something different about her today, something more serious in her eyes. She stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind her. Antonio stood up as she approached, trying to read her expression. "What's going on, Lila?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Lila took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. "It's about your business," she said quietly. "There's been some movement in the underworld. Your enemies, they're regrouping. They're not done with you yet." Antonio's stomach tightened. He had been hoping for a moment of peace, but it seemed his past couldn't be outrun so easily. "What kind of movement?" he asked, his tone hardening. Lila walked over to the desk, pulling out a folder from her bag. "They've been making deals behind your back. The Volkov family has been in talks with several other families to consolidate power. They're trying to take control of your territories." Antonio's jaw clenched. "I thought I dealt with the Volkovs already." "You did," Lila replied. "But they're more dangerous than you realize. This isn't just business. It's personal. They want to destroy you, Antonio. They want to strip you of everything you've built." Antonio's mind raced. The Volkovs were ruthless, but this felt different. It felt more organized, more calculated. And for the first time in years, he felt a pang of fear. He had been operating under the assumption that he was in control, that he could handle whatever came his way. But now, the walls he had built around himself seemed to be closing in. "What should we do?" he asked, looking at Lila, hoping she had some kind of answer. Lila paused for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You need to act fast. You can't let them get comfortable. You have to make a move before they do." Antonio ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts a whirlwind. He had always been the one to make the decisions, to set the course. But now, he found himself relying on Lila, the very woman who had once cleaned his mansion, the woman who had saved him in the courtroom. "I don't know if I can do this on my own," he admitted, his voice low. "You're not alone," Lila replied, her voice steady. "I'm here." It was the first time she had said those words, and they hit Antonio harder than he expected. He had spent his life surrounded by people who were either afraid of him or wanted something from him. But Lila, she was different. She was offering her loyalty not because of fear, but because she believed in something greater. She believed in him. Antonio looked at her, his gaze softening. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You've already done so much for me. I don't know how to repay you." Lila smiled faintly, her eyes warm. "You don't have to repay me, Antonio. Just do the right thing." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. The right thing. He had been chasing power and control for so long that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. But now, with Lila by his side, he realized that there was something more important than his empire, something more important than his reputation. It was the people he chose to trust, the bonds he formed, and the way he treated others. "We'll make a plan," Antonio said, his voice firm with new determination. "We'll take them down before they have a chance to strike." Lila nodded, a small but resolute smile forming on her lips. "I'll help you, Antonio. But you need to trust me. Trust us." For the first time, Antonio felt like he was truly not alone. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting what mattered, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't doing it alone. As they began to discuss their strategy, Antonio realized that this moment, this partnership, was the beginning of something new, something that went beyond business. It was a chance to rebuild, to take back control, not through fear, but through loyalty, trust, and respect. And with Lila by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next. I hope you're ready for the next chapter of this story because things are about to take an even more unexpected turn. Antonio had always prided himself on being in control, but the more time he spent with Lila, the more he realized that control wasn't just about power and intimidation. It was about understanding, loyalty, and trust. In the days that followed their conversation, Antonio put his plan into motion. The Volkov family, along with their allies, had been making moves to take his empire from him. They thought they could break him, but what they didn't know was that Antonio was no longer the same man who had built his empire on fear alone. He was different now, and so was his strategy. The next morning, Antonio called Lila into his office. He had a new plan, one that required more than just brute force. "I've been thinking," Antonio began, his eyes serious. "We need to hit them where it hurts. Not with violence, not with intimidation, but with something they can't ignore, information." Lila raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Antonio walked over to his desk, where several files were spread out. "We've been relying too much on muscle, on power. But information, Lila, that's the one thing they can't control. We need to gather everything we can on the Volkovs, the families they've aligned with, and anyone else trying to take us down." Lila nodded, understanding where Antonio was going with this. "We need to find their weaknesses," she said. Antonio looked at her, impressed by her insight. "Exactly, and I need you to help me with this." Lila was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of what he was asking. She had already proven her loyalty to him, but this was different. This wasn't just about saving him from legal troubles. It was about going after the very heart of the network that had been plotting his downfall. "I'm in," Lila said finally. "But we need to move quickly. We don't know how much time we have before they make their next move." Antonio's eyes met hers, his resolve hardening. "Then we'll make sure they never see us coming." The days that followed were filled with a whirlwind of meetings, covert operations, and careful planning. Lila's mind worked as quickly as ever, piecing together the puzzle of alliances and secrets that the Volkov family and their allies had tried to keep hidden. Antonio watched in awe as she navigated this new world with the same calm precision that she had shown in the courtroom. They worked together in silence, each of them pushing forward, determined to protect what was theirs. Lila had become more than just his maid. She had become his ally, his partner in this fight. It was a strange feeling for Antonio, one he wasn't sure he was ready for, but he couldn't deny the truth. Lila was the one person he trusted more than anyone else. As they pieced together the information they had gathered, Antonio began to realize that this wasn't just about protecting his empire. It was about changing the very way he did business. He had always relied on power and fear, but now he saw that real power came from knowing your enemy, understanding them, and using that knowledge to your advantage. The night before their big move, Antonio and Lila sat in his study, reviewing the final details. "Tomorrow, we make our move," Antonio said, his voice low and focused. "We go after their financial holdings first. We expose the Volkovs for who they really are, criminals hiding behind their legitimate businesses." Lila looked at him, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Are you sure about this? If we do this, there's no turning back. They won't just let you go." Antonio nodded, his expression hardening. "I know, but it's time to stop playing by their rules. This is our fight now, and I'm not backing down." For the first time in years, Antonio felt truly alive. There was a fire in him that had been dormant for too long. And with Lila by his side, he knew they could take on anything. The next day, they set their plan into motion. Lila used her connections, her intelligence, and her meticulous research to expose the Volkovs' dirty dealings. It wasn't long before Antonio's empire began to turn the tide. The Volkovs, who had once thought they could take him down, found themselves on the defensive. Antonio had finally found a way to fight back, not with force, but with the one thing they had never anticipated, knowledge. As the days went by, Antonio could feel the shift. His enemies were scrambling, trying to cover their tracks, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. And as for Antonio, he realized that this fight was more than just about survival. It was about proving that he could be something more than the man he once was, the man who relied on fear. With Lila by his side, he knew that together they could face whatever came next. But more importantly, he knew that they were no longer fighting for just power. They were fighting for something bigger: respect, loyalty, and the chance to rebuild a world based on trust. I hope you're ready for the next chapter, because the stakes have never been higher. After executing their strategic move against the Volkov family, Antonio and Lila were on a high. For the first time in a long while, Antonio felt like he was in control of the situation again. But with the momentum building in their favor, the threats came faster, stronger. They couldn't afford to let their guard down. Not now. Not when they were so close to winning. The Volkov family, known for their cunning and ruthless methods, had started to push back. Their attempts were clumsy at first, small legal battles, a few underhanded tactics, but Antonio knew better than to underestimate them. They were testing him, trying to find a weakness in his armor. And Antonio, for the first time in his life, felt his confidence faltering. He wasn't used to feeling vulnerable, but with Lila's help, they had uncovered cracks in the Volkovs' operations, and they were going to exploit them. Every day now, Antonio felt a growing sense of responsibility, not just for his empire, but for the people who depended on him. People like Lila, who had shown him a different kind of strength. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was personal. But with their enemies closing in, they had to act quickly. "We've made progress," Lila said one evening as they sat in his study, the glow of the desk lamp illuminating her face. "But they're not going to give up easily." Antonio looked at her, his brow furrowing. He knew she was right, but it felt like they were running out of time. "I know," he said, rubbing his temple. "I'm thinking of escalating. We've got leverage, but we need more. I need to hit them harder." Lila's eyes narrowed, studying him. "I've been thinking the same thing," she said, her voice calm but steady. "We know where their money is. Their financial connections are vulnerable. If we cut them off, we can make them crumble without firing a single shot." Antonio looked at her, considering her words. "It's risky," he replied, knowing she was right. "But it might be the only way. We've got them on the defensive, but we need to push them over the edge. They can't keep going if they're financially crippled." Lila stood up, walking over to the window. She looked out into the night, her silhouette framed by the city lights. "Then let's make sure they never recover," she said. "This is about more than just money now. They try to take everything from you, Antonio. You can't let them win." He felt a flicker of admiration for her. There was no fear in her voice, only determination. And for the first time, he realized how much he had come to depend on her. Antonio's entire world had once been about controlling everything around him. But now, as he stood beside Lila, he understood that the real power came from the people you trusted, the people who fought for what was right. "We do this together," Antonio said, his voice steady. "No more hiding behind lawyers or backdoor deals. We take them down in the light of day." Lila smiled, the faintest hint of pride in her eyes. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The next few days were a whirlwind. They focused on taking out the financial infrastructure that propped up the Volkov family, cutting off their money, exposing their illegal dealings, and sending a clear message that they were not untouchable. Antonio's world had always been about moving in the shadows, but now, with Lila by his side, he was stepping into the light. They began to attack from every angle, using every resource at their disposal. Lila's intelligence and meticulous planning were invaluable, and Antonio found himself relying on her more than ever. The Volkov family retaliated, of course. They tried to push back, launching a few legal challenges, making threats, but they were stumbling. Antonio and Lila had anticipated their moves, staying one step ahead at every turn. Then, one night, as Antonio sat alone in his office, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Lila. "They're panicking. They've called in reinforcements. We need to act fast." Antonio stood up, his heart racing. The Volkovs were finally cornered, but they weren't going down quietly. He picked up the phone, dialing Lila's number. "Meet me at the safe house," he said. "We make our final move tomorrow." When he arrived at the safe house, Lila was already there, her eyes focused, her mind working through every detail. "They won't be able to stop us now," she said, her voice low and confident. Antonio nodded, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about how to protect his empire. He was thinking about how to dismantle theirs. "We finished this," he said, the finality in his voice unmistakable. Lila met his gaze, her eyes steady. "Let's make sure it's over." The next day, they made their move. The Volkovs were hit from all sides, financial accounts seized, their criminal connections exposed, their illegal operations disrupted. It was a calculated, strategic strike, and it left the Volkovs reeling. By the time they realized what had happened, it was too late. Antonio stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching as everything they had worked for came crumbling down. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a victory won by fear or brute force. It was a victory built on trust, loyalty, and the courage to fight for what was right. As the dust settled, Antonio turned to Lila, a small smile on his face. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Lila nodded, her eyes reflecting the same satisfaction. "We did it together," she replied. And for the first time in his life, Antonio understood what real power meant. I hope you've been following closely, because the turning point is here. After their decisive strike against the Volkov family, Antonio and Lila found themselves standing at the precipice of something they had never anticipated: peace. The enemy had been dealt with, their operations dismantled, their financial empire shattered. For the first time in years, Antonio felt a weight lift from his shoulders. His empire was secure again, but something had shifted in him. The ruthless methods that had once defined his reign no longer seemed as necessary. And Lila, the one person who had stood by him through it all, was the reason for this change. The two of them had built something together, something stronger than mere business. It was trust, it was loyalty, it was a bond that neither of them could deny. But as the days passed and the adrenaline of the victory wore off, a new question began to form in Antonio's mind. What now? Lila had proven herself time and time again, and she had become not just a trusted ally, but someone he could depend on in ways he had never imagined. But as much as he relied on her, he couldn't help but feel a growing distance between them. He had been so focused on building his empire, on surviving the threats that came from every corner, that he hadn't really stopped to consider what kind of future he was building, one without fear, without power struggles. As he sat alone in his study one evening, staring out at the city lights below, Antonio realized that the success of their efforts meant more than just taking down their enemies. It meant rebuilding everything he had lost in the process. His humanity, his sense of purpose, and most importantly, his connection with the people around him. He had always kept his emotions buried beneath layers of authority and cold calculation, but now, with everything at stake, it felt like it was time to confront the truth. He had allowed Lila to become a part of his world, a part of his life in ways that were both unexpected and necessary. But what did that mean for them? What did it mean for him? That evening, when Lila arrived at his study, he looked at her differently, not just as his partner in business, but as the woman who had changed everything. "Lila," he began, his voice steady but with a hint of vulnerability. "We've accomplished a lot together. You've helped me build something that I didn't think was possible, and for that, I will always be grateful. But there's something I've been thinking about." Lila looked up at him, her expression unreadable, but he could see the flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "What's on your mind, Mr. Vargo?" she asked softly, her voice calm. Antonio exhaled, then stood up and walked over to the window. "I don't know how to explain this," he said, his gaze lost in the cityscape outside. "For so long, I've been driven by power, by control. I thought that was the only thing that mattered. But after everything that's happened, after everything we've done, I realize now that there's more to life than that." He paused, turning to face her, his heart beating faster. "I've been afraid to trust people, to let anyone in. But you've shown me that there's another way. And I don't want to go back to the way things were." Lila stood silently for a moment, taking in his words. "I didn't do it for you, Antonio," she said finally. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. I don't need anything from you. But I understand what you're saying." She stepped closer to him, her voice unwavering. "Trust isn't something that can be built overnight. But it's not impossible." Antonio met her gaze, feeling something shift in the air between them. He had spent so many years pushing people away, surrounding himself with fear and distance. But now, with Lila's words, he felt the walls around him start to crumble. "I know," he said quietly, "but I want to try. I want to try to be better, to be more than just the man I've been." Lila nodded, her expression softening. "That's all anyone can do, Antonio. The past is the past, but we still have a choice in how we move forward." Antonio stepped closer to her, his voice low but steady. "I want you to stay, not just as my partner in business, but as someone I trust, someone I care about." Lila looked up at him, her eyes searching his. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then she nodded, her lips curling into a small smile. "I'm here, Antonio. I'll stay, but only if you're ready to change." Antonio felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before. It wasn't just about business, about empire building. It was about life, about connection, about the people who mattered. "I am," he said softly. And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. The two of them stood there, in the quiet of the study, the city lights flickering outside. It wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of something new, something Antonio had never dared to hope for. A future not built on power, but on trust, loyalty, and a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to live. I hope you're ready for what happens next, because things are about to escalate once more. The moment Antonio and Lila shared in his study marked a turning point, an unspoken agreement to move forward, together. But even with their newfound understanding, the past was never far behind, and it had a way of catching up when least expected. In the days following their conversation, Antonio began making sweeping changes, trying to turn his empire into something based not just on power, but on trust. He delegated more responsibility, allowed his trusted inner circle to take charge of day-to-day operations, and started focusing on rebuilding what had been lost. But with every victory came a new threat, one that Antonio was starting to recognize in a way he never had before. The world he'd built was crumbling beneath the weight of the very tactics he had used to construct it. His decisions were no longer just about securing his legacy. They were about changing who he was, about becoming a man who didn't need to rely on intimidation and fear. Lila had sparked this change in him, and with her guidance, he realized that even the darkest parts of his empire could be reshaped, perhaps into something better. But, as he would soon learn, some enemies would never give up so easily. It was late one evening when Antonio received a call that would throw him back into the chaos. It was from one of his old contacts, someone he had trusted in the past, but who had long since fallen into obscurity. Mr. Vargo, the voice on the other end said, barely audible over the crackling static. You need to know something. The Volkov family, they've made their move. They're not done. Antonio felt the chill of recognition creep down his spine. Even with everything they had done, with all the steps they had taken to eliminate the threat, the Volkovs were still out there, plotting their next move. Antonio slammed his fist down on the desk, his anger flaring up. How did they find out? He demanded, his voice a low growl. We covered our tracks. This isn't possible. The voice on the other end hesitated before replying. They have eyes everywhere, Antonio. Even within your own circles. They've learned to play the long game. Antonio's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. They had been careful, so careful, but they had missed something. Something critical. I need to see the evidence. Where are they now? They're in New York, the contact replied. I'll send you the details. But be careful. They're not playing by the same rules anymore. The line went dead, and Antonio stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. He felt the weight of the situation settle over him, heavy and suffocating. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built with Lila's help, was at risk. This time, it wasn't just about business. It was about survival. And he couldn't afford to fail. Antonio paced around his office, his thoughts spinning. His old methods, intimidation, manipulation, and brute force, would no longer work. He couldn't just throw money at the problem or rely on fear to control the situation. He needed to think strategically, to use his mind in ways he hadn't done in years. And there was only one person who could help him now, Lila. He picked up the phone and dialed her number, his fingers trembling slightly. Lila, he said when she picked up. We need to meet. The Volkovs are still out there. They're planning something big. There was a pause on the other end, and then Lila's calm voice replied, I know. I've been keeping an eye on their movements. I knew they wouldn't back down so easily. Antonio's stomach twisted. She had always been ahead of him, always thinking 2 steps ahead. What do we do now? He asked, trying to mask the panic rising in his chest. We strike first, Lila said firmly. We go after them before they have a chance to make their move. We take control of the narrative. Antonio could feel his heart rate slow at her words. She was right. The Volkovs were dangerous, but they were also predictable. They had made their move, and now it was their turn. He had learned to trust Lila with his life, and now, he had to trust her with their future. I'm ready, he said, the resolve in his voice clear. We take them down. The next few days were a blur of activity. Lila worked behind the scenes, gathering intel, connecting with her network, and building a strategy that would catch the Volkovs off guard. Antonio used his influence to push back on their financial operations, making sure they knew he was ready for whatever they threw at him. Together, they worked as a team, each contributing in their own way, each pushing the other to stay ahead of the game. But just as they thought they had the upper hand, The Volkovs made their move. Antonio was at his desk, reviewing the latest intel when his phone rang. It was Lila. "They're hitting us now," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "They're going after our most vulnerable assets. We have to move fast." Antonio's blood ran cold. He had prepared for this, but nothing could fully prepare him for the level of retaliation the Volkovs were capable of. "I'll take care of it," Antonio said, standing up, his voice filled with determination. "We finish this now." He hung up the phone, his mind already formulating a plan. He was no longer just the man who ran an empire with fear. He was a man who had learned to trust, to rely on those who had proven their loyalty. And together, they would take down the Volkovs once and for all. As he left the office, ready for what was coming, Antonio knew that this final battle would define everything. Not just for his empire, but for his future, and for the relationship he had built with Lila. The pieces were in place, and there was no turning back. I hope you're ready for the next part, because it's all about to come to a head. The Volkov family, relentless and dangerous, had finally made their move, pushing Antonio and Lila to the edge. Antonio was no longer the man who sat in the comfort of his empire, surrounded by power and fear. He was someone who had learned the true meaning of loyalty, trust, and what it meant to fight for something more than just survival. The battle had escalated, and it was no longer about who had the most money or muscle. It was about who had the courage to finish what they started. The night before they launched their final strike, Antonio stood in his office, alone. His mind was racing. Every step they had taken, every plan they had executed, had led them to this moment. He could feel the weight of everything pressing on him. The empire he had built was at risk, but so much more was on the line. Lila had given him something he never thought possible, something worth fighting for, beyond all the power and wealth, trust. They had built something together, and no matter the cost, he couldn't let it crumble. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," Antonio said, his voice steady. Lila stepped into the room, her presence always calm but strong. "Everything is set," she said, her tone quiet but assured. "The Volkovs won't know what hit them." Antonio turned to face her, the weight of the situation lifting slightly with her words. He had grown used to working with Lila, but tonight, it felt different. This wasn't just a business deal. This was personal. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice tinged with the anxiety he'd kept hidden for so long. Lila met his gaze without hesitation. "We've planned every detail. We'll hit them hard and fast. We can't afford to hesitate now." Antonio nodded. It was a relief to have someone so steady by his side. "I trust you," he said simply, his voice firm. Lila's expression softened ever so slightly. "And I trust you." The words hung in the air between them, carrying a weight neither of them could ignore. It wasn't just about surviving the Volkov family's assault anymore. It was about what they were building together, something Antonio never thought he could have. "Let's finish this," Antonio said, a new resolve in his voice. The next day, they moved swiftly. Lila's network had done its part, and Antonio's resources were put to full use. They moved on every front, attacking the Volkov family's weak points, exposing their dirty secrets, and cutting off their financial lifeblood. But even as they struck, Antonio couldn't shake the feeling that the Volkovs were still planning something bigger, something more dangerous. He had learned not to underestimate them, but this time, he wasn't going to let them get away. He needed to find the final piece of the puzzle. As they gathered their forces, Antonio and Lila received word that the Volkovs had started to retaliate. It wasn't a direct attack. They were trying to destabilize Antonio's allies, stirring chaos within his network. It was a calculated move, but one that Antonio had expected. He wasn't going to fall for it. "They're trying to break us apart from the inside," Antonio said, his voice cold as he reviewed the intel. "We can't let them. They've made their move, now we make ours." Lila looked at him, her eyes sharp. "It's time to take everything they've built and tear it down, piece by piece." Antonio didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. He picked up the phone and made the call. "It's time to end this. No more games. We take them down now." Within hours, the final blow was struck. Antonio's allies, who had been on the fence, rallied to his side when they saw the depth of the Volkov family's treachery. Together, they wiped out the last remnants of the Volkovs' operations. Their financial networks crumbled, their allies turned against them, and their empire fell apart. By the end of the day, The Volkovs were nothing more than a shadow of their former selves. As Antonio sat in his office that evening, watching the sunset over the city, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. It was over. They had won. The empire was secure. But more importantly, Antonio had found something he never thought he would: trust, loyalty, and a future that wasn't defined by fear. Lila entered the room, her presence as strong as ever. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction. Antonio looked at her, feeling a sense of gratitude he had never known. "We did," he replied, his voice steady. He didn't need to say more. The words were in the air between them, no longer just business partners, but something more. Something real. "Thank you," he added, his voice softer. "For everything." Lila smiled, her expression warm but still grounded. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "We did this together." Antonio looked out the window again, his thoughts clearer than they had ever been. This wasn't the end, he knew that. It was the beginning of something new. With Lila by his side, he wasn't just fighting for power. He was fighting for something worth protecting, the future they would build together. The journey ahead would be filled with challenges, but Antonio knew now that he wasn't alone. And with that knowledge, he was ready for whatever came next. I hope you're ready for what happens next, because things are about to shift again. The aftermath of their victory was still settling in, and Antonio Vargo was beginning to realize that he had won more than just a battle. He had won a chance at something he never thought possible. As the days passed and the dust of the Volkov family's defeat settled, Antonio found himself at a crossroads. His empire was intact, his enemies were scattered, and yet, the sense of fulfillment he had expected was absent. For the first time in years, he had everything he had ever wanted, but it didn't feel like enough. In the quiet moments, when the business was slowing down and there were no more crises to address, he would find himself thinking about the one person who had changed everything for him, Lila. She had been by his side through it all, helping him rebuild not just his empire, but also himself. They had gone from allies to partners, and now, there was a bond between them that couldn't be denied. He found himself wanting something more, but he wasn't sure how to say it, or if he even could. That night, as he walked through the grand hallways of his mansion, Antonio found himself at the door of Lila's quarters. For so long, he had kept his emotions in check, buried beneath the surface of his authority. But now, with everything at stake, he couldn't ignore them any longer. He needed to talk to her. He knocked gently on the door. "Lila," he called softly, his voice unsure. A moment later, the door opened, and Lila stood before him, her expression neutral but warm. "Mr. Vargo," she said, her voice calm as always. "What's on your mind?" Antonio took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "Can we talk?" Lila stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. As he walked in, he noticed the way the room was set up, simple, understated, yet everything in it reflected her presence. He had always been surrounded by opulence, but Lila had a quiet elegance about her that stood in stark contrast to everything he had built. Antonio sat down at the small table, and Lila followed suit, sitting across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Antonio broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "about everything we've been through, and everything that's happened. I'm grateful for everything you've done, for me, for the Empire. You've changed everything for me." Lila's gaze softened, but she said nothing, allowing him the space to speak. "But I don't know if I can keep living the way I have been," he continued, his words slow and measured. "I've spent so many years building this empire with fear, with power. But now, with you, I realize that I don't want to live like that anymore. Not just for business, but for life." Lila remained silent, her eyes never leaving his. Antonio leaned forward, the weight of his confession heavy in the air. "I can't go back to what I was. I don't want to. I want to change, become the person I've always avoided becoming." Lila reached out, placing a hand on the table between them. "And what does that mean, Antonio? What do you want?" Antonio felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. He had always been in control, always had a clear path forward, but now he was at a loss for words. "I want to build something different," he said quietly. "I want to build something real. And I don't want to do it alone. I want you with me, Lila. Not just as a partner in business, but as more than that. You've been the one constant through all of this, the one person I can trust. I can't imagine my life without you in it. Lila sat back, her fingers brushing against the surface of the table as she processed his words. Antonio's heart raced in his chest, his mind spinning. He had never said anything like this before. He had spent his life building walls, pushing people away, but now, standing in front of Lila, he realized that the walls had come down. I don't know how to ask this, he continued, his voice barely a whisper. But will you be with me, Lila? Will you be by my side, not just in business, but in life? Lila remained silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. Antonio felt the weight of the world on his shoulders as he waited for her answer. And then, finally, Lila smiled, softly, warmly. I'm already here, she said, her voice quiet but filled with certainty. I've been with you through everything, and I will continue to be with you. But this, she paused, her eyes meeting his. This is not just about the empire anymore, Antonio. This is about us. And I'm ready to build something real with you. Antonio's heart surged with relief, the tension that had been building inside him for so long melting away. He had taken the first step towards something he never thought possible, and now, with Lila's words, he knew he wasn't alone. The future was no longer just about power or wealth. It was about something far more important: trust, loyalty, and the chance to create a life together. As Antonio and Lila sat there in the quiet of the room, the weight of the past few days seemed to disappear. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were partners, building a future that was theirs. And for the first time in his life, Antonio felt the real power wasn't in controlling everything around him. It was in sharing it, in trusting someone else to be there with him. And with Lila by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. I hope you're ready for the final chapter of this journey. The decision Antonio and Lila had made to rebuild everything together was now becoming more than just a dream. It was a reality. In the weeks that followed their commitment, things began to shift in ways Antonio had never expected. The empire that had once been a symbol of his ruthless control was now transforming into something else. It was no longer just about power. It was about creating something meaningful, something built on trust and integrity. But old habits die hard. As they worked together, building not just their business but their lives, the shadows of Antonio's past were never far behind. He had made enemies over the years, and while the Volkov family was no longer a threat, there were still others lurking in the background, waiting for their chance to strike. It was a reality Antonio had come to accept, but it didn't make it any easier. Lila, ever the steady force by his side, had proven to be more than just a partner in business. She had become the center of his world. And though they had both changed, the challenges they faced were far from over. One evening, Antonio sat alone in his office, reviewing some financial reports, when he received an unexpected call. It was a number he didn't recognize. Hesitant, he answered the phone. Mr. Vargo, a voice on the other end said. You don't know me, but I know you. The voice was low, clipped, and familiar. Antonio's heart sank. Who is this? He asked, his tone icy. The voice paused before answering. Let's just say I'm someone who knows the truth about your past, and I think it's time you paid the price for it. Antonio's mind raced. This wasn't just a random call. It was a warning, a threat. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed, on the phone in his hand. What do you want? He asked, his voice colder now. What do you think I want? The voice replied. You've been too comfortable, Antonio. Too careless. You've forgotten who you are and what you've done. And now it's time for you to remember. The line went dead before Antonio could respond. He sat there for a long moment, his mind spinning. The weight of the threat hung heavily in the air. There was someone out there who knew everything about him. Everything he had buried, everything he had tried to leave behind. But who? And why now? He couldn't afford to wait around for answers. His empire, everything he and Lila had worked for, was on the line again. Antonio stood up from his desk and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. He had always been a man who faced his problems head-on. But this was different. It wasn't just about business or power anymore. It was about survival. And this time, he wasn't going to do it alone. He needed Lila. She had been his rock through everything, and she was the only person he trusted completely. He picked up the phone again, dialing her number. Lila, he said when she answered. We've got a problem. There was a pause on the other end. What happened? She asked, her voice calm as always. Someone just called me, Antonio said, his voice low. They know about my past. They're threatening to expose everything. I don't know who they are, but they know exactly what I've done, and they're going to use it against me. Lila didn't say anything for a moment. Antonio could hear the quiet determination in her voice when she spoke next. We'll handle this, Antonio. You're not alone. We'll figure out who's behind this and make sure they never get the chance to hurt you. Antonio exhaled, a sense of relief washing over him. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words until now. Thank you, he said, his voice quieter. I don't know what I would do without you. You don't have to worry about that, Lila replied firmly. We're in this together. We always have been. The next few days were a blur of frantic activity. Lila dove into her network. Using every connection, she had to trace the source of the threat. Antonio focused on securing their operations, making sure no one could exploit their weaknesses. But no matter how much they searched, the person behind the call seemed to be just out of reach, always one step ahead. The tension between them grew as the days went on. Antonio hated feeling this vulnerable. He hated the uncertainty. But with Lila at his side, he knew they could face anything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lila came to him with the information they had been waiting for. I found them, she said, her voice steady, but with an edge of satisfaction. It's someone from your past, a rival who was left behind when you took control of the city. They've been waiting for the right moment to strike. Antonio felt his blood run cold. He knew exactly who she was talking about. The name brought a rush of memories he'd spent years trying to forget. What do we do now? He asked, his voice tight. Lila looked at him, her eyes unwavering. Now we end this. For good. Antonio nodded. He had been running from his past for too long. It was time to face it head on, and this time, he wasn't going to let it control him. As they prepared for their final confrontation, Antonio felt a calm settle over him. The battle wasn't over, but with Lila by his side, he knew they could handle whatever came next. He had fought for power his entire life, but now, he was fighting for something much more important. His future, his peace, and the life he wanted to build with Lila. And with that resolve, he was ready to take on whatever came next. I hope you've been following closely because this is where everything finally comes together. Antonio and Lila had done everything they could to protect their empire, to keep their lives intact, and to rebuild something from the ashes of their past. But even as they began to see the fruits of their labor, there was still one final challenge waiting for them. The threat from Antonio's past had finally caught up with him, and he knew that it was time to face it head on. They had spent days preparing for this moment, strategizing and making sure they were one step ahead of their enemies. The final confrontation was set. Antonio and Lila had learned that survival wasn't about brute strength or fear. It was about intelligence, strategy, and most importantly, trust. The trust they had built in each other was their greatest weapon. As Antonio stood in his office, looking out over the city he had fought so hard to control, he couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. The battle was far from over, but he was no longer the man he had been. He was stronger, not because of his empire, but because of the people who believed in him, especially Lila. When the time came, Antonio and Lila moved swiftly. They knew their rival's plan, and they executed their strategy with precision. The network of enemies that had once seemed so invincible was now crumbling under their calculated moves. But just as they thought they had gained the upper hand, something unexpected happened. The man behind the threat, the one from Antonio's past, made his final move. He tried to strike a blow where it would hurt them most, taking down everything Antonio and Lila had built. The attack came swiftly and without warning. For a moment, Antonio felt the familiar rush of panic and fear that had haunted him for so many years. But this time, it was different. He wasn't alone. He had Lila. As the pieces began to fall into place, Antonio realized that this wasn't just about the empire anymore. It wasn't about protecting his wealth or his power. It was about something more, something that could never be taken away. It was about the trust they had in each other, the bond they had formed, and the new life they were building together. They weren't fighting just to survive, they were fighting to thrive. With Lila by his side, Antonio felt a strength he had never known before. They countered every move with precision, every twist and turn with intelligence. In the end, it wasn't just about defeating their enemies. It was about standing together, stronger than ever. When the final blow was struck and the threat was eliminated once and for all, Antonio and Lila stood side by side, watching the aftermath. The empire was theirs. But more than that, They had created something more meaningful than power. It was respect, loyalty, and the freedom to be who they truly were. Antonio turned to Lila, his eyes filled with gratitude and something more, something deeper. "We did it," he said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. Lila smiled, the calm strength in her eyes unchanged. "We did it together," she replied, her voice steady and sure. For the first time in Antonio's life, he didn't feel the need to dominate or control. He didn't need to fight to hold on to power. He had something more, something far more valuable. A future built on trust, on love, and on the partnership they had forged. They had come through the storm, stronger and more united than ever. And as they walked away from the ruins of their past, Antonio knew one thing for certain. With Lila by his side, the future was theirs to build. Together. In this captivating story, we explore the emotional depth of Antonio Vargo's journey as he navigates a world where power and control once ruled, but now trust and loyalty are the true forces that drive him forward. As the story unfolds, we dive into the challenges Antonio faces, from overcoming the shadow of his past to forming an unexpected bond with Lila, a woman who helps him rebuild everything he thought he had lost. Their relationship blossoms through adversity, leading to a compelling story filled with intrigue, danger, and undeniable connection. This narrative brings a fresh twist to romance stories, where love is not just an emotion, but a foundation for personal growth and change. As Antonio and Lila face external threats and internal battles, their journey proves that romance stories can go beyond just romantic relationships. They can encompass transformation, redemption, and mutual respect. Their partnership becomes more than just a business alliance. It becomes a love story that defies expectations. If you enjoy romance stories with complex characters, intricate plots, and an emotional roller coaster, this tale is for you. Antonio's transformation from a man driven by fear and power to one led by love and trust sets the stage for a new chapter in his life, where romance stories take on a deeper meaning. Follow their journey as they learn to trust each other and face challenges together, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most unexpected places.